At my daughter's wedding, I overheard my son-in-law telling his best man that he had cheated on her and was only marrying for our family's money. And in that single, nauseating moment, everything inside me went cold and clear. So I just made one call, and right before he said, "I do," the police walked in. And the look on Brad's face when those handcuffs appeared was worth every sleepless night I'd spent investigating this fraud. If you're watching this story unfold, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from, because I love hearing from people who appreciate good revenge served ice cold. But let me back up 6 months, because this disaster didn't happen overnight. Brad Thompson was playing the long game, and unfortunately for him, I've been playing longer. It started when my daughter Sarah brought home what she called the perfect man, and at 55 years old I have learned that when something seems too perfect, it usually is. But Sarah was 32, successful in marketing, and I figured she could handle her own love life wrong again. Sarah and I have been tight since her father David died 5 years ago. David left us comfortable, his engineering patents and life insurance meaning we weren't worried about money. The house paid off, Sarah's college fund turned into savings, and I had enough for a comfortable retirement. We weren't flashy, but in Cedar Ridge word gets around about who has what. Brad appeared like a romance novel character, tall, dark hair, blue eyes that seemed sincere, and a smile that could sell ice to penguins. He drove a nice BMW, dressed sharp, and claimed to work in investment consulting, which is fancy talk for I help rich people shuffle money around. That first Sunday dinner, I watched him work my dining room like a politician at a town hall, complimenting my pot roast, asking intelligent questions about David's engineering work, showing perfect interest in family photos, and bringing expensive flowers from downtown, not gas station carnations. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, taking my hand with both of his, in that practiced way that immediately triggered my detector. "Sarah's told me so much about you. I can see where she gets her strength and grace." And I almost laughed, because if he only knew my idea of grace was not telling him what I really thought of his oversized charm, offensive. But Sarah was glowing, absolutely radiant, in a way I hadn't seen since before David died. She hung on Brad's every word, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and kept shooting me hopeful looks that screamed, "Please like him, Mom." So I smiled and played the charmed future mother-in-law, because that's what moms do. We bite our tongues and hope our instincts are wrong. After dinner, while Sarah got dessert, Brad settled in David's chair like he owned it, and started asking casual questions about our financial situation. How was I managing as a widow? Did Sarah help with expenses? Had we made investment decisions lately? And though red flags were multiplying like rabbits, I kept my voice sweet and my answers vague. "We're managing fine, thank you." "I'm sure you are," he said with that practiced smile. "But if you ever want opportunities to make your money work harder, I'd happily review your portfolio." Family rates, of course. Family rates. We'd known each other 3 hours. When Sarah returned with my famous apple pie, Brad transformed back into the devoted boyfriend so seamlessly, it was almost impressive. The man was a chameleon, and I suspected we weren't seeing his true colors. After they left, I stood at the sink washing dishes, trying to identify exactly what bothered me about Brad Thompson. On paper, he was everything a mother wants for her daughter. Charming, crazy about Sarah, financially stable, but I trust my instincts. And they were screaming that Brad Thompson was performing, not being himself. And the question was, what was he hiding? As I dried the last plate, I decided to pay closer attention to Mr. Perfect, because in my experience, men who seem too good to be true usually are. And 6 months later I would be sitting in church, listening to that same charming man confess that my daughter meant nothing more than a paycheck. By the second dinner, Brad brought wine that cost more than my weekly groceries. Not that I complain about good wine, but it was another puzzle piece that didn't fit his supposed income level. "This is lovely, Brad," I said, examining the Bordeaux that was probably older than Sarah. "Special occasion. Every dinner with your family is special, Mrs. Harrison," he replied smoothly, a politician's answer that sounded nice and said nothing. And Sarah beamed like he'd just recited Shakespeare. My daughter with a marketing master's who can spot sales pitches from orbit, completely buying whatever Brad was selling. Love makes you stupid. During dinner, Brad shared work stories about helping high-net-worth individuals manage portfolios, dropping investment firm names, and mentioning clients with multiple homes and luxury cars, all of it sounding impressive and completely vague. So I cut through the charm and asked, "So, who exactly employs you?" "I'm independent," he said smoothly. "Gives me flexibility to focus on individual client needs." which translated to, he didn't work for anyone legitimate and there was no way to verify his stories. Yet Sarah nodded like he'd just explained quantum physics. While they admired my roses outside, I did what any sensible mother does. I Googled him, and Brad Thompson Investment Consulting returned millions of results, none matching our Brad. Adding Cedar Ridge got nothing, no business license, no professional certifications, no LinkedIn matching his description, and, for someone supposedly working with wealthy clients, Brad Thompson had remarkably little online presence, either very professional or very suspicious. When they returned, I was innocently sipping tea in my living room, the cup warm between my palms, the house quiet in that ordinary way that makes you believe nothing at all is about to change. And then Sarah said, "Mom," settling beside Brad with that particular glow that always meant news, "and Brad, and I think it's time for me to change my investment strategy." And my tea paused mid-sip because something in the way she said it made the air shift. So I asked, "What changes?" And Brad leaned forward with earnest concern, explaining that Sarah mentioned she's keeping her inheritance in traditional savings, and with inflation and market volatility, she's losing money yearly, which was not wrong, not technically, but something about his delivery triggered my mother radar in a way I couldn't ignore, and he continued smoothly, saying he was assembling a conservative portfolio. Nothing risky, just diversified funds and stable growth opportunities, and I answered neutrally that it sounded wonderful, that Sarah's always been money smart, while what I thought was, why is my daughter's 6-week boyfriend suddenly managing her finances? And what I said instead was, "I'm sure you'll make good decisions, honey, because here is the motherhood truth that no one prepares you for. Sometimes you must let adult children make their own mistakes, even when you see disaster approaching." And over the following months, Brad became a fixture at every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every community event Sarah attended, charming to neighbors, helpful around the house, devoted to Sarah, the surface perfect boyfriend. But I noticed things, the casual questions about our finances, the particular interest in David's inheritance details, in Sarah's trust fund, in our major purchases framed as concern, yet feeling like reconnaissance. And then the inconsistencies, because Brad claimed a Connecticut upbringing but didn't know basic state facts any native would, said he was a Yale graduate but couldn't name his freshman dorm, mentioned a wealthy background but had working class tells that no polish could hide. So I started keeping mental lists of Brad's stories and checking them for consistency, and they weren't consistent at all. But Sarah was happier than she had been since David died, sleeping better, laughing more, discussing future plans with a brightness that had been missing for too long. And I found myself asking if, because Brad made her that happy, I was simply playing the suspicious mother-in-law based on feelings alone. And the answer was absolutely, though those feelings were about to prove very accurate, because 6 months in, Sarah announced they were moving in together. Brad had found a great deal on a house across town, a rental supposedly perfect for testing domestic life, and she gushed, showing me phone pictures of a beautiful place, saying Brad knows the landlord, so we're getting way below market rate. And as I looked at the clearly expensive home photos, I wondered how Brad had secured such a deal yet again, but I smiled and told her I was happy. And that night, alone, for the first time in months, without Sarah and Brad's laughter filling the rooms, I decided I would discover exactly who Brad Thompson really was. Because my daughter might be love-blinded but I was not, and something about Brad's too-perfect performance was setting off every alarm I possessed, which meant it was time for real detective work. And 3 months after Sarah moved in with Brad, they announced their engagement at my Sunday dinner table. And I should have been thrilled because Sarah glowed, the ring was gorgeous, and Brad seemed happy, yet instead I felt as if I were watching a performance unfold in front of me. And Sarah practically shoved her hand in my face, saying, "Mom, look, where a stunning solitaire caught the light, at least 2 carats, definitely real." And I said honestly that it was beautiful, because the ring was lovely and also expensive, more than someone claiming independent investment consulting should afford. And Brad beamed proudly, saying he wanted something worthy of Sarah, gazing into her eyes like they were alone, and insisting she deserved the best. And the romantic in me melted while the mother in me wondered where he had gotten the money for a ring, probably costing more than my car. So I asked innocently how he had found something so perfect, and he said smoothly that he had a friend in the jewelry business who gave him a great deal on a stone returned by another customer, which meant another great deal. because Brad had remarkably lucky connections with people offering expensive discounts. And he was either incredibly fortunate or something else was happening. But Sarah radiated happiness, so I hugged them both and opened the good champagne I had saved for special occasions. And we toasted their future while I tried to ignore the warning voice in my head. And over the following weeks, wedding planning consumed Sarah's life as she approached every detail with marketing campaign intensity, creating spreadsheets for everything from flowers to seating charts. And Brad played the perfect supportive fiancé, agreeing with her choices and suggesting helpful vendors offering deals, because Brad knows someone doing catering for half price, and his friend gets wholesale flowers. And I started thinking that Brad Thompson knew an extraordinary number of people willing to work below market rates, which meant he was either incredibly well connected or incredibly good at finding people participating in something shady. And meanwhile, I hired a private investigator, Patricia from my book club, who was discreet about researching Brad's background and whose findings were interesting, because there was no record of Brad Thompson attending Yale, Connecticut upbringing records, no business license for his investment firm, a credit history that only went back 3 years, employment history suspiciously vague, and most interesting of all, a Bradford Thompson had been arrested in Nevada 2 years ago for investment fraud, the same age and similar description, though charges were dropped when victims suddenly refused testifying. And Patricia couldn't prove it was the same person, but the coincidence troubled me deeply, and unfortunately, coincidences are not proof. So I couldn't present Sarah with a maybe it's him mugshot expecting a wedding cancellation, which meant I needed more evidence. So I decided to pay closer attention to Brad's behavior. And what I discovered was that Brad Thompson was excellent at asking the right questions, because during family dinners he would casually steer conversations toward our finances, asking how much David's patents were worth, whether I had considered refinancing for low rates, whether Sarah was maximizing retirement contributions, framing everything as helpful concern while building a comprehensive picture of our family assets, with particular interest in Sarah's inheritance. And one evening while Sarah used the bathroom, he said quietly that Sarah mentioned she's been conservative with investments, and with the wedding coming and our future ahead, maybe it was time for more aggressive portfolio management. Aggressive how? I asked conversationally, keeping my tone light even as something inside me tightened, and Brad answered smoothly that he was developing a real estate investment opportunity. Nothing risky, just commercial property likely to appreciate significantly over coming years, and that Sarah could get in early. And I said it sounded complicated because Sarah prefers simple investments, and that was exactly the problem, Brad said earnestly. Simple investments don't build real wealth. Sarah's smart, but she's played too safe, and with proper guidance her inheritance could double in 5 years or disappear entirely. I thought, though, what I actually said was, I'm sure you'll figure out what's best. And the wedding was set for June, which gave me 3 months to determine what Brad Thompson was really planning. 3 months to decide whether I was paranoid or whether my instincts were trying to save my daughter from the biggest mistake of her life. Because here is what 55 years have taught me: when someone seems too good to be true, has answers for everything, and their story has truck-sized holes, they are usually hiding something big. And the question was, what was Brad hiding, and how much damage would he do before I proved it? And wedding planning brings out the best and worst in people, and Brad Thompson was no exception, because the closer it got to June, the more controlling he became about the details, not in ways obvious enough to alarm Sarah, but in subtle ways that made my skin crawl, saying things like, I really think we should use my friend's catering company, when Sarah mentioned other options. They're giving us such a good deal and I've worked with them before. Or my photographer friend understands the shots we want. We don't want risks with someone new. And slowly Brad steered Sarah toward vendors he had personally selected, until every aspect of the wedding was being handled by people who had some relationship to Brad, which was not romantic planning but controlling behavior wrapped in pretty bows. And meanwhile, investigator Patricia had been busy tracking down to Nevada women who had relationships with someone matching Brad's description around the time of those investment fraud charges, both of whom lost significant money and were too embarrassed to press charges when their boyfriend disappeared. And Patricia told me during our bookstore coffee meeting that the patterns were almost identical. A charming man appears, becomes the perfect boyfriend, gains financial access, and vanishes with everything portable. And I pointed out that he was marrying Sarah, so why go through the trouble of marriage if he planned to disappear? And Patricia suggested that maybe marriage gives legal access to more money, or maybe he was planning a longer con. Get married, control finances, then disappear once he had cleaned out everything possible. And the thought sickened me, but explained Brad's behavior, because he wasn't just dating Sarah. He was positioning himself to take everything she had, and I needed proof. Not suspicions or coincidences, but actual evidence that would convince Sarah her perfect fiancé was a fraud. And the problem was that Brad was excellent at covering his tracks, which was when I developed a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane, deciding to test Brad's story by arranging surprise encounters with his supposed past. Because if he truly grew up wealthy in Connecticut, really attended Yale, really worked high-end finance, then he should be able to handle meeting someone from that world. So I called my college roommate Helen, who had married well and lived in Greenwich, Connecticut. Helen, who was old money and the type who would actually know the families and institutions Brad claimed to be associated with. And I told her I needed a favor and asked if she could visit next month and meet Sarah as fiancé, because I wanted a second opinion. And Helen agreed, and we arranged for her to surprise me during one of Brad and Sarah's regular Sunday dinners. And that Sunday when Helen arrived, I watched Brad's face carefully as I introduced her as my Greenwich College friend. And for just a moment something flickered across his expression, a flash of panic calculation before the charming smile returned. And he said enthusiastically that Greenwich was a beautiful area and he had family friends there, asking if she knew the Hamiltons who lived near the yacht club. And Helen smiled politely and said, "Greenwich isn't that small, dear." But she had been a yacht club member for 30 years, and which Hamiltons did he mean? And I watched Brad's smile tighten almost imperceptibly as he said, they were family friends of his parents and that he didn't know them personally well. A smooth recovery, but Helen wasn't finished. And she asked about Yale and which residential college he attended. And Brad said Pearson without hesitation. And Helen said lovely because her nephew graduated Pearson recently and asked what year he graduated. And Brad rattled off a year, and Helen nodded thoughtfully and asked if he might have known her nephew Tommy Whitfield. And Brad said the name sounded familiar. And Helen's smile stayed perfectly pleasant as she said that was funny because Tommy attended Princeton, not Yale, and she had never had a nephew. And the silence that followed could have been cut with knives. Sarah looked confused. Brad looked like he was calculating escape routes, and I felt as if Christmas morning had arrived early. And Brad attempted to laugh it off, saying he must have misheard the name and that, family connections. Everyone knows everyone, but details get confused. And Helen said sweetly that of course it was easy to get confused about these things. And after Brad and Sarah left, Helen and I sat in my kitchen with wine, dissecting the encounter. And she said firmly that that man had never been within 50 miles of Greenwich society and definitely did not attend Yale. That he might have studied school catalogs, but he had never actually been there. And I asked what I was supposed to do with that information because Sarah would not believe me based on one uncomfortable conversation. And Helen suggested I get more evidence and set more traps because if he was lying about his background, he was probably lying about other things. And she was right. And I had 2 months until the wedding to prove it. But what I did not know was that Brad had already started cleaning out Sarah's accounts, because 2 months before the wedding, Sarah casually mentioned while we were shopping that she and Brad had made exciting investment decisions with her inheritance money, saying they had found this amazing opportunity, and that Brad had been working on it for months, and they had finally gotten approved. And my blood froze as I asked what kind of investment, and she said it was private real estate development, luxury condos in Colorado Springs, and that Brad said the returns could be incredible, and since they were marrying anyway, it made sense to start their future together. And I managed to keep my voice steady. "How much did you invest?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while my heart pounded in my chest. And Sarah, still focused on the dress in her hands, said casually, "Most of it about $400,000, but Brad says we could double that in 2 years." And the number echoed in my mind like a gunshot. $400,000. Sarah's entire inheritance from David gone, in one investment decision made with a man whose background I could not verify. And I said carefully, "Sarah, did a lawyer review the investment documents?" But she replied that Brad handled everything, and then finally looked at me and asked why I was making that face because I looked sick. And I was sick because my daughter had just handed her life savings to someone I increasingly believed was a con artist based solely on his word. So I told her I thought it was important to be careful with large investments and maybe someone independent should review the paperwork, and her expression shifted to mild irritation as she said Brad's a professional and this is what he does, and she trusts him. And trust is the word con artists count on more than anything. and that night I called Patricia and asked her to dig deeper into Brad's supposed real estate deal, because if Sarah had invested $400,000, there should be documentation somewhere. And what Patricia found made my worst fears look optimistic, because there was no record of any real estate development matching the description. The company Brad supposedly used did not exist. The property address led to an empty lot that had been for sale for 5 years, and based on bank records I accessed the money, went into a Brad-controlled account, and was immediately transferred to multiple offshore accounts. The money was gone, Margaret, all of it, and I sat in my kitchen staring at the wedding invitation proofs Sarah had left on my counter, trying to process what I had learned, that Brad Thompson had stolen my daughter's inheritance and she had no idea. And the wedding was 8 weeks away. 8 weeks to figure out how to expose Brad without destroying Sarah. And I considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? That my daughter voluntarily gave money to her fiancé for an investment that turned out fake, because unless I could prove Brad deliberately defrauded her, it would look like business deals gone wrong. And I considered confronting Brad directly, but that would give him time to disappear before the wedding. And somehow I was becoming convinced that the wedding itself was part of his plan, because if Brad married Sarah, he would have legal access to more assets, her retirement accounts, her portion of my estate when I died, anything she inherited or earned during the marriage. And the wedding was not the end of his con, but simply the next phase, which meant I had to stop it. But how do you convince someone the man they love is a criminal when they are wearing his ring and planning their future? So I decided to set one more trap, thinking that if Brad was truly the con artist type, he would not resist the opportunity for more money, especially if he believed he was about to gain permanent access to family resources through marriage. And I began dropping hints about a fictional inheritance I was supposedly expecting from a distant relative. Nothing obvious, just casual mentions of paperwork I was handling, and lawyer phone calls, telling Sarah and Brad during dinner that Aunt Ruth was always the family eccentric, and I never expected her to remember me in her will, but apparently she left me something significant, and the lawyers said it could be substantial. And Brad's interest was immediate and intense, as he called it wonderful news and said unexpected. Inheritances can really change financial pictures, and I continued that the lawyers wanted a meeting next week to discuss details, something about tax implications and investment strategies, and Brad offered smoothly that he would be happy to review any documents because these situations can be complex and I would want to ensure I was making the right decisions. And there it was, Brad Thompson, offering to help manage money that did not exist. And over the following weeks, I fed him carefully constructed details about my fake inheritance, the amount growing in my stories, and his interest growing along with it as he began asking pointed questions about estate planning, whether I had updated my will recently, and how I was thinking about leaving assets to Sarah, even suggesting one evening that after he and Sarah married it might make sense to consolidate some financial planning because family trusts can be very tax efficient. Family trusts controlled by Brad, no doubt. And the wedding was 4 weeks away when I finally decided what I had to do. Time to set the ultimate trap. And 3 weeks before the wedding, I did something that made me either the best mother in the world or the most devious. I planted a listening device in Brad's car. And before anyone judges me, I will explain that. Patricia had law enforcement contacts and one specialized in surveillance equipment, providing a tiny recording device completely undetectable that would pick up conversations inside Brad's BMW. And Patricia warned me this was probably illegal, as she showed me how it worked. And I replied that so was stealing $400,000 from my daughter, and I was willing to take risks, because I figured if Brad was really planning to con Sarah, he would eventually discuss it with someone, maybe his real partner, maybe another victim, maybe in phone calls, arranging exit strategies, and the device would record everything and give me the proof I needed to save Sarah. And for 2 weeks, I listened to the most boring recordings imaginable. Brad talking to vendors about wedding details, mundane phone conversations with unidentifiable people, even singing along to the radio, and I began to wonder whether he was the most innocent man alive, or simply very careful about where he had sensitive conversations. And then 1 week before the wedding, I hit the jackpot when Brad was having lunch with someone called Danny, and their conversation was very enlightening because Danny asked if he was sure about the timeline, since it seemed like he was cutting it close with the wedding next Saturday. And Brad replied that as soon as they were legally married, he would have access to everything: trust accounts, retirement funds, plus whatever the old lady leaves her when she dies. Danny said, And Brad answered icily, "What about the 400 you already got?" And then laughed, calling it just the appetizer because the real money comes after marriage, telling him to give him 6 months to clean out everything he could access before filing for divorce and disappearing, saying she would be too embarrassed to come after him, seriously. And when Danny asked what if she figured it out before then, Brad replied that she wouldn't because Sarah was completely under his spell, that she thought he was Prince Charming and her mother was just a suspicious old bat, and by the time either of them realized what was happening, he would be long gone with everything they had. And I sat in my kitchen listening to my daughter's fiancé calmly discussing how he planned to destroy her life, and felt a rage, unlike anything I had ever experienced, because Brad Thompson was about to learn what happens when you mess with a mother's child. Yet I knew I needed more than recordings. I needed to catch him in the act in front of witnesses, with no doubt left about his intentions. And the wedding was 6 days away. 6 days to orchestrate the downfall of a professional con artist who believed he was smarter than everyone else. So, I spent the next 3 days making careful preparations, first calling Patricia and asking her to contact her police friends about potentially arresting someone at a wedding, then calling the venue to ask about security procedures, and finally making a specific request to the ceremony minister, telling Reverend Mitchell that I needed him prepared for unusual circumstances during the wedding, and that there might be interruptions and I would need him to delay the ceremony, if necessary. And Reverend Mitchell, who had known our family for years, trusted my judgment enough to agree without asking too many questions. And the night before the wedding, I called Sarah to check on final preparations, and she told me she was so nervous but so happy and could not believe that tomorrow she would be Mrs. Thompson. And I asked her one last time if she was sure about this, because marriage is a big step, and she said firmly she had never been more sure of anything, and that Brad was everything she had ever wanted in a husband, and she was the luckiest woman alive. And my heart broke slightly knowing what I was about to do to her, but believing a broken heart was better than a destroyed life. So I told her I loved her, and that whatever happened tomorrow she should remember that everything I did was because I loved her. And she said she loved me too, and that I was going to love being Brad's mother-in-law, because he thought the world of me. And if only she knew what Brad really thought of both of us. And the wedding morning dawned bright and clear with perfect weather for what was about to become the most dramatic ceremony in Cedar Ridge history. And I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit appropriate for both weddings and courtrooms before driving to the church, carrying my purse with the recording device inside and a cell phone programmed with the direct number for Detective Morrison, the police contact Patricia had arranged. And Sarah looked beautiful in her wedding dress, radiant with happiness that was about to be shattered. And Brad looked handsome in his tuxedo, every inch the devoted groom. And if I had not heard his conversation with Danny, I might have believed I was wrong about everything, but I had heard it, and in a few hours everyone else would too. And the atmosphere was magazine perfect with Cedar Ridge community. Church transformed with white roses and golden ribbons, and guests arriving in their finest clothes. And Sarah was in the bridal suite finishing her makeup while I sat in the front pew trying to calm my nerves and review my plan. And at 3:45, 15 minutes before the ceremony start, I excused myself to use the restroom but instead walked around to the side of the church where Brad's BMW was parked among the other wedding party cars, and that was where I found him on the phone confirming everything I had suspected about his character, telling Danny that in about 20 minutes he would officially be married to his retirement fund, and laughing at whatever Danny said in response, assuring him that the girl was so naive she would sign anything he put in front of her, and that he had already gotten her to put most of her money into that fake investment, and once they were married he would have access to her retirement accounts, and could start working on the mother's assets too. And my blood pressure spiked, but I kept listening as he said the old lady had a house worth at least $300,000 plus whatever she had in savings, and that Sarah mentioned life insurance money too, and that in 6 months he could clean out everything they had. And when Danny asked what if they got suspicious, I could hear him clearly, because Brad had the phone on speaker, thinking he was alone, and he said they would not, because Sarah thought he walked on water, and even if the mother started asking questions, who was going to believe he was a con artist since he had references and business cards and the whole setup, and by the time anyone figured out what was happening, he would be in another state with a new identity. And when Danny asked if he was sure about the timeline, Brad answered that after the ceremony they were having photos and then the reception. I'll make sure to have conversations with the mother about helping her with finances now that I'm officially family, plant seeds early, you know, and then tomorrow we're off on honeymoon. And when we get back, I can really start working on consolidating their assets, Brad said. And I had heard enough, more than enough. So I pulled out my phone and began recording, capturing the rest of his conversation as evidence while he continued, saying the best part was that Sarah was so desperate to be married, she would probably forgive him even if she did find out that her dad died when she was young, and she had major abandonment issues, and would do anything to keep from being alone again. And that was when I stopped recording and started seeing red, because talking about stealing our money was one thing, but analyzing my daughter's vulnerabilities while planning to exploit them was something else entirely. And Brad Thompson had just crossed a line he could never come back from. So I walked back into the church and took my seat, checking my phone to make sure the recording was saved before sending a text to Detective Morrison that simply said, "It's happening, come now." And at exactly 4 o'clock the organist began playing the processional music as bridesmaids walked down the aisle in pale pink dresses, followed by the maid of honor. And then the music shifted into the traditional wedding march, and Sarah appeared at the back of the church, looking absolutely beautiful and absolutely happy. And for one fragile moment I wondered if I was making the biggest mistake of my life, if perhaps I was wrong and Brad truly loved her and I was about to destroy my daughter's happiness based on misunderstood conversations and circumstantial evidence. But then I remembered the cold calculation in Brad's voice when he spoke about exploiting Sarah's abandonment issues, and my resolve hardened because my daughter deserved better than a man who saw her vulnerabilities as opportunities. And Sarah walked down the aisle on her godfather's arm, since her own father could not be there to give her away, glowing with happiness. And when she reached the altar and took Brad's hand, the love in her eyes was unmistakable while Brad played the devoted groom perfectly, looking appropriately nervous and deeply moved, and whispering something that made her smile. And Reverend Mitchell began the ceremony with the traditional words, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the joining of Sarah Elizabeth Harrison and Bradford Michael Thompson in holy matrimony." And I listened to the familiar phrases and watched Brad's performance, knowing that in just minutes everything was going to change. And the ceremony proceeded normally through the readings and homily, as Sarah and Brad exchanged vows they had written themselves. Sarah's heartfelt and genuine, while Brad's were perfectly crafted to sound romantic while committing to nothing specific. And then came the ring exchange, and I could see we were approaching the moment I had been waiting for. And when Reverend Mitchell reached the traditional point and said, "If anyone present knows of any reason why this couple should not be joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace," I knew this was it, my moment, and I began to stand, heart pounding, ready to play the recording that would expose Brad for what he truly was. But before I could say anything, Brad's best man, a nervous-looking man I had never met before that day, grabbed Brad's arm and whispered urgently in his ear. And everything changed when I saw Brad's face shift, and the charming groom mask slip just enough to reveal the calculating predator underneath, his eyes scanning the congregation before landing on me with recognition and fury flashing across his features as if he somehow understood I was responsible for whatever was happening outside. And when Reverend Mitchell asked if there was a problem, Brad answered smoothly that there was no problem at all, though sweat was beading on his forehead and he blamed it on wedding day nerves. And that was when I stood fully and said, "Actually, Reverend Mitchell, there is a problem," loudly enough for the entire congregation to hear, explaining that I had something very important everyone needed to know about the groom. And the church fell completely silent as Sarah's face turned white and she stared at me in shock and confusion and whispered, "Mom, what are you doing?" And I told her I was saving her from making the biggest mistake of her life, and that everyone there needed to hear what her fiancé really thought about this marriage. And Brad stepped toward me with his charming facade gone entirely and suggested I was having some kind of episode and should sit down. And I replied that the only episode I was having was a sudden attack of honesty, which was more than I could say for him, Bradley Wilson, and the use of his real name struck him like a physical blow as several guests gasped and Sarah looked back and forth between us in confusion, while Brad insisted he did not know what I thought I knew, though his voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "I know that your real name is Bradley Wilson, not Bradford Thompson," I announced to the stunned congregation, my voice echoing in the silent church. "And I know that you've been running marriage cons for years, targeting women with money and disappearing after you clean out their accounts. and Brad said it was ridiculous. But he was looking around the church like a trapped animal searching for an escape. And I continued that I knew he had convinced my daughter to invest $400,000 in a fake real estate development, and that the money was already gone. And Sarah made a small wounded sound and lifted her hand to her throat, as if she could physically hold back the truth. And I raised my phone and said I knew, because I had a recording of him explaining his entire plan to his partner. And that was when Brad truly panicked, because instead of denying it or trying to charm his way out of the situation, he bolted. Right there at the altar in front of 200 wedding guests, hiking up his tuxedo and running for the side door of the church. But Detective Morrison and 2 other officers were waiting just outside, and the congregation erupted into chaos as shouting and the sounds of struggle drifted in from beyond the doors. And Sarah sank into a chair with her beautiful wedding dress pulling around her as she stared at the doorway, where her fiancé had disappeared, and whispered in a broken voice, "Mom, what just happened? I don't understand what just happened." And I sat beside her and took her trembling hands and told her I was so sorry, so very sorry, but Brad was not who he said he was, and never had been. And when she whispered about the investment money and asked if it was really gone, I nodded and watched my daughter's world crumble in real time. And Reverend Mitchell stepped forward to take control, asking the confused congregation to move to the fellowship hall while things were sorted out. And most guests filed out buzzing with shock and confusion, while Sarah's maid of honor, her cousin Lisa, stayed with us, along with a few close family friends. And a few minutes later Detective Morrison returned and introduced himself formally, confirming that Brad was in custody and that they would need statements from both Sarah and me. But based on the evidence I had provided and what they had already uncovered about his previous activities, he would be charged with multiple counts of fraud. And Sarah looked up at the detective through tears and asked how much trouble she was in because she had given him the money willingly. And Detective Morrison gently assured her she was not in trouble because she was a victim of fraud, and giving him money did not make it legal if he had obtained it through false pretenses. And when she asked what happened now, he explained that now they would build a case against him and try to recover as much of her money as possible, adding that Bradley Wilson had been on their radar for a while and she was not his first victim, but with the evidence we had provided, she might be his last. And after the detective left to continue his investigation, I sat with my daughter in the empty church surrounded by white roses and shattered dreams. And she quietly asked how I had known, and I told her it was mother's intuition and a very good private investigator. And when she asked how long I had known, I admitted I had suspected from the beginning and had been investigating him for months. And she was silent for a long moment before saying the money Dad left her was really all gone. And I told her most of it was, but that money could be replaced and she could not. And the aftermath of the wedding that never happened became the biggest story Cedar Ridge had seen in decades. And by Monday morning, everyone in town knew that Sarah Harrison's fiancé had been arrested at the altar for fraud, and the gossip mill was working overtime. Yet, instead of judgment and whispers, we received an outpouring of support that reminded me why I loved small-town living, with neighbors bringing casseroles and friends offering shoulders to cry on, and even people I barely knew stopping by to express sympathy and admiration for exposing Brad before it was too late. And my neighbor Dorothy told me, as she helped clean up wedding gifts that would need returning, that I had done the right thing, and that Sarah was lucky to have a mother who paid attention. And Sarah stayed with me for a few days while she tried to process everything that had happened. Remarkably calm, considering her world had imploded, though I could see the pain in her eyes every time she glanced at her wedding dress hanging in the guest room. And on Tuesday, Detective Morrison called with an update saying they had made significant progress and that Bradley Wilson had been using multiple identities for at least 5 years, and they had identified 7 other victims in 4 different states. And when I asked if there were 7 other women like Sarah, he confirmed that there were, all with similar patterns, women who had recently inherited money or gone through divorces with substantial settlements, always the perfect boyfriend, always pushing for quick marriages, always disappearing once he gained access to their finances. And when I asked how much money they were talking about, he said total damages across all victims exceeded $2 million, and that my daughter's case was actually one of the larger individual thefts. The number made me sick, physically sick, in a way that seemed to rise from my stomach and settle heavy in my chest, because Brad had stolen Sarah's inheritance like it was pocket change, as if it meant nothing at all. And the worst part was knowing he'd been doing it to other women for years, moving from one trusting heart to another, without a flicker of remorse. What are the chances of recovery? I asked, forcing the words out past the nausea, and the answer came back steadier than I felt. Better than usual. Actually, because you caught him before he could disappear completely, we've been able to freeze several accounts. We won't recover everything, but we might get back 60 or 70%. It was better than nothing. I knew that, but it still meant Sarah had lost over $100,000 to a man who had never loved her, not for a second, not in any real way that mattered. Wednesday, Patricia stopped by with additional information she'd uncovered about Brad's background, and the air in my living room felt tight as she sat across from Sarah and me and laid it out piece by piece. His real name is Bradley Wilson, and he's 34 years old, she told us. He grew up in foster care in Nevada, dropped out of high school, and has a history of small-time cons going back to when he was 18. Sarah's voice was small, but steady when she asked, "So, everything about his background was fake?" Patricia didn't hesitate. Everything. No wealthy family, no Yale education, no successful business. He learned to imitate upper-class behavior by studying it online and practicing on smaller targets before moving up to bigger cons. I felt a chill crawl up my arms. How did he know so much about investments and finance? I asked, because that part had seemed so convincing. He didn't really, Patricia explained. He learned enough terminology to sound impressive. But if you'd asked him detailed questions, his knowledge was very shallow. He counted on charm and confidence to carry him through. Sarah shook her head slowly, disbelief and shame warring across her face. I can't believe I fell for it. Don't blame yourself, Patricia said firmly. Bradley Wilson was very good at what he did. He studied psychology, learned how to identify and exploit emotional vulnerabilities. This wasn't your fault. Thursday, I got a call that surprised me. It was from one of Brad's other victims, a woman named Helen Morrison from Portland, her voice cautious but determined. "Detective Morrison gave me your contact information," Helen explained. "I wanted to thank you for stopping him. If you hadn't caught him when you did, he would have moved on to target more women." My throat tightened as I asked, "How much did he steal from you?" There was a pause before she answered. $60. I thought I was investing in a wine importing business with the man I was going to marry. The bitterness in her voice cut deep. "He disappeared the night before our wedding, and I never saw him again." "I'm so sorry," I said, because what else could anyone say to that kind of betrayal? "Don't be sorry. Be proud. You did what none of the rest of us could do. You stopped him. Your daughter is lucky to have you." After I hung up, I stood there for a long moment thinking about Helen and the other victims, about the invisible thread that connected them all, because Sarah wasn't just one woman who'd been hurt by Brad's lies. She was part of a pattern. One of many women whose lives had been damaged by a predator who saw their love as a business opportunity. Friday, exactly 1 week after the wedding disaster, Detective Morrison called with news about Brad's arraignment. He's been charged with 7 counts of fraud in multiple jurisdictions, the detective told me. His public defender is trying to work out a plea deal, but with the evidence we have, he's looking at significant prison time. How significant? I asked, needing something concrete to hold on to. Probably 8 to 12 years, depending on how much cooperation he provides about any accomplices. It wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't enough. No amount of prison time would compensate for what he'd put Sarah and the other women through, for the humiliation and the shattered trust and the money that represented years of work and hope. But it was something, and sometimes something is all you get. That evening, Sarah and I sat on my back porch watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. The sky streaked in soft oranges and purples, and we talked quietly about the future. "I keep thinking about what Detective Morrison said," Sarah told me, her voice thoughtful and fragile all at once, "about Brad studying psychology to exploit people's vulnerabilities. What vulnerabilities did he see in me?" It was a hard question, the kind that doesn't have an easy answer, but it was an important one. "You wanted to be loved," I said gently. "You wanted someone to build a life with. Those aren't weaknesses, honey. Those are normal human desires." She swallowed. "But I was so naive. I gave him access to everything without asking enough questions." "You trusted someone you thought you loved," I reminded her. "That's what people do in relationships." She turned to me then, and I could hear the fear beneath her next words. "How do I ever trust anyone again?" "Carefully," I said after a moment. "But you do trust again, because the alternative is spending your life alone, and that's not living. That's just existing. Sometimes being a mother means protecting your child from obvious dangers. Sometimes it means protecting them from dangers they can't see coming. Charming men, who lie as easily as breathing. And as I sat there beside my daughter, feeling the cool evening air settle around us, I knew with a fierce, quiet certainty that I had done my job. My daughter was safe, and Bradley Wilson was going to prison. And for the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling that sharp edge of panic under my ribs. 6 months after the wedding disaster, life had settled into a new normal, the kind you don't choose but slowly learn to live inside. And Sarah had moved back into her own apartment and was seeing a therapist to work through the emotional trauma of Brad's betrayal, taking it one honest session at a time. And she'd also started dating again, very cautiously, and with firm ground rules that included background checks for anyone she got serious about. I know it sounds paranoid, she told me over lunch one Tuesday, pushing her salad around her plate as if the word itself tasted bitter. But after what happened with Brad, I'm not taking any chances. It's not paranoid, I assured her gently. It's smart. There's nothing wrong with verifying that someone is who they claim to be. The financial recovery had been better than expected. Between frozen accounts and assets that Brad hadn't had time to move, we'd recovered about $250,000 of the $400,000 he'd stolen. And while it wasn't everything, it was enough for Sarah to begin rebuilding her financial security without feeling like the ground beneath her was permanently cracked. Brad himself had pleaded guilty to multiple fraud charges and been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, and his accomplice, Danny, had also been arrested and was serving a shorter sentence in exchange for his cooperation. 10 years isn't enough, Sarah had said when we heard the sentence, her voice steady but her jaw tight. No, I'd agreed, but it's what we got, and at least other women won't have to go through what you did. The trial had become a media sensation, reporters fascinated by the story of the con artist who'd been exposed at his own wedding, and several news programs had interviewed us, turning me into something of a minor celebrity as the mother who'd saved her daughter from a marriage fraud. "You're famous, Mrs. Harrison," the grocery store clerk told me one afternoon when a tabloid at the checkout featured a photo of me beneath the headline, "Supermom Saves Daughter from Wedding Day Con Man." "Famous for being suspicious," I replied dryly, not entirely sure that was the kind of fame I'd ever wanted, but the attention had led to something unexpected and genuinely worthwhile. I'd been contacted by several organizations that help fraud victims, and before long, I'd started volunteering to speak at seminars about romance scams and how to protect yourself from them. The most important thing to remember, I would tell audiences, looking out at faces that were hopeful and afraid all at once, is that love shouldn't make you stupid. If someone is pressuring you to make financial decisions quickly, if their background doesn't check out, if your family and friends are expressing concerns, pay attention to those red flags. Sarah had started coming to some of the seminars with me, brave enough to share her own experience so other women could recognize the warning signs sooner than she had. "I thought I was smart enough not to fall for something like this," she would say honestly, "but con artists are professionals. They study psychology, they practice their techniques, and they're very good at what they do. The key is verification. Check their story, check their background, and don't let anyone rush you into major decisions." The seminars became strangely therapeutic for both of us, a way of turning our painful experience into something that might spare someone else similar trauma. And one evening in December, almost exactly a year after Brad had first appeared in our lives, Sarah and I were decorating my Christmas tree when she voiced something that had been quietly sitting in my own heart. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think Dad would have seen through Brad's act?" I considered it carefully, because David had been a good judge of character, even if he'd also been more trusting than I was. "I think your dad would have asked more questions about Brad's work," I said finally. As an engineer, he was always interested in details, and Brad's explanations about his business were very vague. Dad might have pushed for specifics that would have exposed the lies. "I miss him," Sarah said quietly, her fingers stilling on a glass ornament. "I keep thinking that if he'd been alive, none of this would have happened." "Maybe not," I admitted softly, "but you can't live your life wondering what might have been different. What matters is that we got through it and we stopped Brad from hurting anyone else." She looked at me then and smiled through the ache. "I'm proud of you, for trusting your instincts even when everyone thought you were being overprotective." "I'm proud of you, too," I replied, "for surviving something that would have destroyed a lot of people, and for turning it into a way to help others." As we continued decorating, I realized how much had changed in just a year. Sarah was stronger now, more cautious but not bitter, and I had discovered that I was capable of playing amateur detective when necessary, and we had both learned that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look like Prince Charming. "You know what?" Sarah said suddenly. "What?" "I'm glad it happened." I stared at her. "You're glad you almost married a con artist?" "No," she said with a small smile. "I'm glad you caught him before I actually married him, and I'm glad we learned what we're capable of when we need to protect each other." She was right. As painful as it had shown us that we were stronger than we'd ever known. "Just promise me one thing," I said. "What's that?" "When you do get married to someone whose background we've thoroughly investigated, let's have a very quiet, very small ceremony." "Deal." Sarah laughed, "but I reserve the right to invite at least one reporter just in case we need a witness to another arrest." We both laughed then, and in that laughter I felt something settle into place. I knew we were going to be okay. 2 years later, I found myself sitting in the same church where Sarah's wedding disaster had unfolded, but this time the atmosphere was genuinely joyful, light, instead of suffocating. Sarah was getting married again, this time to David Martinez, a teacher she'd met at one of our fraud prevention seminars, and unlike Brad, David had been thoroughly vetted by both me and the private investigator I'd kept on retainer. His background checks out completely, Patricia had assured me after her investigation, and for once, I believed it without fear. Born in Cedar Ridge, went to State University, been teaching at the same high school for 8 years, no secret identities, no mysterious financial dealings, no history of fraud. He's exactly who he says he is. Almost suspiciously normal, I joked, but I was relieved. David had proposed after a year of dating, but not before sitting down with me for what he called the interrogation. "Mrs. Harrison," he'd said during a family dinner, "I know that Sarah's previous experience has made this family cautious about trusting people. I want you to know that I understand that, and I'm prepared to answer any questions you have about my background, my finances, my intentions, or anything else you want to know." I'd appreciated his directness, and over the following months, I'd come to genuinely like David. He was kind, funny, and clearly devoted to Sarah, but more importantly, he understood what she'd been through and was patient with her lingering trust issues. The new wedding was everything Sarah's first attempt hadn't been: small, intimate, and absolutely authentic. 30 guests instead of 200, wildflowers instead of exotic arrangements, and a groom who was genuinely nervous instead of performing nervousness. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mitchell began, and I felt my shoulders tense automatically. The last time I'd heard those words in this church, they'd been followed by one of the most dramatic scenes in Cedar Ridge history. But this time, when Reverend Mitchell reached the part about objections, I remained seated and silent. No one interrupted, no one ran for the exits, and no police officers appeared. David and Sarah exchanged rings and vows. They'd written themselves, heartfelt, sincere, and completely real. When Reverend Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife, the only surprise was how perfectly normal everything was. At the reception, held in my backyard with catering from the local deli, I found myself talking to Detective Morrison, who'd become something of a family friend after the Brad Wilson case. "Any word on how our favorite con artist is doing in prison?" I asked. "Brad's been a model prisoner, apparently," Detective Morrison said. "He's teaching financial literacy classes to other inmates, which I find ironically appropriate." "Teaching them how to steal money?" I asked. "Teaching them how to manage money legally. Actually," he said, "turns out he really did learn a lot about finance during his con artist years. The warden says he's quite good at it." "Think he's actually reformed?" I asked. Detective Morrison shrugged. "Hard to say. Con artists are good at playing whatever role they think will benefit them, but he's got 7 more years to figure out who he wants to be when he gets out." Later in the evening, as the reception was winding down, Sarah pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Mom, I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I got a letter from Brad last month." I felt my blood pressure spike. "He contacted you from prison. Is that even legal?" "It's allowed, apparently. He wanted to apologize, and I wrote him back." I stared at my daughter in shock. "You wrote back to the man who tried to steal your life savings?" "I told him I forgave him," Sarah said calmly. "Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because carrying that anger was hurting me more than it was hurting him." I thought about that for a moment. "How do you feel now?" "Free," Sarah said simply. "For the first time since all this happened, I feel completely free of it." I looked across the yard at David, who was helping clean up tables and chatting easily with our neighbors, and I understood what Sarah meant. The Brad Wilson chapter of our lives was finally, truly closed. You know what I realized today? Sarah continued. What? Brad actually did me a favor. I raised an eyebrow. How do you figure that? If I'd married him, I would have spent years in a fake marriage with someone who didn't actually love me. Instead, I'm married to someone who knows exactly who I am and loves me anyway. Someone who thinks my paranoia about background checks is endearing rather than annoying. When you put it that way, I suppose Brad did do us all a favor, I said, though I still thought 10 years in prison wasn't enough. Mom, yes, thank you for trusting your instincts, for investigating him, for saving me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Thank you for forgiving me for ruining your first wedding. You didn't ruin it, Sarah said firmly. You've saved me from it. There's a difference. As the last guests left and we finished cleaning up, I reflected on how much our family had changed over the past 3 years. We'd been tested by betrayal and fraud, but we'd emerged stronger and wiser. Sarah had learned to trust her own judgment while still remaining open to love. I'd learned that sometimes being a protective mother means being willing to be the villain in your child's story, at least temporarily. And we'd both learned that the most important thing in life isn't avoiding all risks. It's learning to recognize which risks are worth taking and which ones are just dangers disguised as opportunities. That night, as I went to bed in my quiet house, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. My daughter was married to a good man who loved her genuinely. Our family had survived a crisis that could have destroyed us, and I'd helped other families avoid similar tragedies through our fraud prevention work. Brad Wilson had tried to con the wrong family. He'd underestimated a mother's instincts and a daughter's resilience. And in the end, his attempt to destroy our lives had only made us stronger. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even. It's building a better life from the wreckage someone else tried to create. And that's exactly what we've done. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.